What is up, everybody? Welcome back to Jared Speaks, episode 23. Quick thank you before we get into it because I mean it every time. Whoever you are, wherever you are listening from, thank you for being here. Today is a long one and a deep one, so settle in. Last episode, we talked about how some people have a constant voice narrating their thoughts, and some people do not have anything like that at all. Today, we're going somewhere that question opens up once you really start pulling on the thread. Not just how you think, how you actually experience anything at all. Let's go. Look at something red right now, if you can. A shirt, a sign, anything. Now ask yourself something that sounds simple and is actually one of the strangest, most unsolved questions in all of science and philosophy. Is the red you are seeing the same red I am seeing? Not the wavelength of light, the part that is measurable, agreed upon. The same number whether you measured it or I do. I mean the actual experience. The feeling of redness happening inside your own mind right now. Is there any way, even in principle, to know whether that inner experience matches mine or anyone else's at all? The answer is no. Nobody has ever solved this. Some of the smartest people who have ever lived have spent entire careers on this exact question, and it remains genuinely, completely open. Today, we're going deep into it. Let me start with the word you may not have heard before, but is about to make a lot of things click into place. Qualia. Plural of qual. Is the term philosophers use for the raw subjective quality of an experience, not the information context of the experience. The actual felt quality of it, the redness of red, the specific taste of coffee, separate from the chemical compounds that produce it, the particular ache of sadness, separate from whatever event caused it. Qualia are the what it feels like part of any experience, as opposed to what it does part. Here's why that distinction matters so much. Science is extraordinarily good at explaining what it does part of almost everything. We can explain exactly what happens when light of a certain wavelength hits your retina. We can trace the signal through the optic nerve, which watch it get processed in the visual cortex and follow it all the way to a point where you say out loud, that is red. Every single physical step of that chain can be mapped, measured, and explained. What science has never been able to explain, not once, not even close, is why any of that physical experience should be accompanied by an actual felt experience at all. Why does all of that electrical and chemical activity not just happen silently in the dark, with no one home to experience it? Why is there something it is like to be you, processing the light, rather than nothing at all? That gap between fully explaining the mechanism and explaining why there as a felt experience riding along with the mechanism, is what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness. The phrase itself comes from a philosopher named David Chalmers, who laid it out clearly in a paper in 1995. Chalmers made a distinction that I think is one of the most useful distinctions in all of philosophy of mind. He separated what he called the easy problem of consciousness from the hard problem. The easy problems, and he is using easy in a relative sense. These are still genuinely difficult scientific questions. Are things like, how does the brain integrate information from different senses? How does attention work? How does the brain distinguish wakefulness from sleep? How do we report our own internal states? These are easy in the sense that, in principle, you can imagine eventually mapping out the exact mechanism. Difficult, but solvable through neuroscience. The hard problem is different in kind, not just in degree. Even if you fully solve every single one of these easy problems, even if you had a complete map of every neuron, every signal, every mechanism in the brain, and could predict behavior perfectly, you still would not have explained why any of it is accompanied by a subjective experience. You would have a complete description of the machine and still have explained nothing about why the machine feels like something from the inside, rather than just running its processes with the lights off. This is not a fringe philosophical concern. It sits at the center of consciousness research, and serious scientists and philosophers remain genuinely divided on it. Some believe it will eventually be explained through more advanced neuroscience. Some believe it is, in principle, unsolvable using the tools science currently has. Some believe it points towards something about the nature of reality that we have not yet found the right framework to even ask the question properly. Let me give you one of the most famous thought experiments built around this problem, because I think it makes the abstract idea land in a much more concrete way. It is called the knowledge argument, developed by a philosopher named Frank Jackson in 1982. And it is usually told through a character named Mary. Imagine Mary as a brilliant scientist who has spent her entire life inside a black and white room. She has never seen a single color. But she has had access to every textbook, every research paper, every piece of philosophical information about color that has ever existed. She knows everything there is to know, in purely physical terms, about what happens when light of a certain wavelength enters the eye. She knows the exact neural pathway. She could draw you the entire mechanism from memory in perfect technical detail. One day, Mary walks out of the black and white room and sees a red apple for the first time in her life. The question the thought experiment asks is simple. Does Mary learn something new in that moment? Most people's intuition says yes, even though Mary already had complete physical knowledge of color, actually experiencing red for the first time gives her something that all of the physical information never could: the felt quality of redness itself. If that intuition is correct, it suggests that physical information alone, no matter how complete, cannot fully capture what an experience actually is. There is something extra, something only direct experience can provide. This argument has been challenged, debated, and refined for over 40 years now, and there is still no settled answer. But I think it gets at something real, something that matches what most people feel intuitively when they really sit with the question. Knowing everything about a sunset is not the same as watching one. Now, let's go directly at the question I opened with. Is your red my red? This is sometimes called the inverted spectrum or inverted qualia thought experiment. And its roots actually go back centuries to the philosopher John Locke in the 1600s, though it has been developed much further by modern philosophers since. Here's the setup. Imagine that from birth, what I experience when I look at something red is exactly what you experience when you look at something green, and vice versa. Not that I am colorblind, not that anything is physically wrong with either of us. Our eyes detect the same exact wavelengths. Our brains process the information the exact same way, structurally. We both learn to call the same objects by the same color names because we were both taught the same language using the same objects. I learned to call fire engines red because that is what everyone around me called them. And you learn the same thing using the same word, pointing at the same object. But the actual inner felt experience that accompanies that wavelength of light, for me, it might be what you would call green. If you could somehow climb inside my head and compare notes, and there would be absolutely no way for either of us to ever know. Why not? Because every external thing we could possibly compare, the word we use, the wavelength we are responding to, our behavior around the color, which traffic light we stop at, all of that would be identical. The only thing that could possibly differ is the private, subjective, internal quality of the experience itself, the part that nobody else can directly access. Not a scientist with the most advanced brain scanner ever built. Not someone who loves you and knows you better than anyone else alive. Nobody. That is what makes this such a genuinely strange and important question. It is, by its very nature, unanswerable using any tool we currently have, or possibly any tool we could ever build. Because it is asking about the one part of reality that is permanently locked away from outside observation. Your own experience from the inside is the one thing in this entire universe that only you will ever have direct access to. David Chalmers, the philosopher who named the hard problem, built another thought experiment to push on the same question from a different angle. It is called the philosophical zombie, often shortened to P zombie. And I promise this has nothing to do with horror movies. Imagine a being that is, in a very single physical respect, identical to a normal human. Same body, same brain, same neurons firing in exactly the same patterns. This being would walk, talk, laugh, cry, say ouch when injured, say I love you, and mean it in every functional behavioral sense. From the outside, in any test you could possibly run, this being would be completely indistinguishable from a regular conscious person. The only difference is that there is nothing it is like to be this being. No inner experience at all. No felt quality of red, of pain, of love. Just the physical processes running, producing all the right outputs, with absolutely no one home experiencing any of it. Chalmers uses this thought experiment to argue that if such a being is even conceivable, if you can imagine it without logical contradiction, then consciousness cannot be fully explained by physical processes alone. Because here is a being with all the same physical processes and no consciousness at all. Other philosophers push back hard on this, arguing that a being physically identical down to every detail genuinely could not lack consciousness. That the thought experiment smuggles in an assumption that does not actually hold up. I'm not going to settle that debate for you tonight. Nobody has settled it in 30 years of serious academic argument. But I want you to sit with the question itself for a second, because I think it's one of the strangest and most important questions a human mind can ask about itself. How do you know with complete certainty that anyone else around you has an inner experience at all, rather than just behaving exactly as if they do? I want to bring this out of pure philosophy for a minute and ground it in something we actually have real evidence for, because I think it makes it the more abstract questions feel less like science fiction and more like something worth taking seriously. We already know, with real documented evidence, that perception varies enormously between people in ways most people never think about. We talked about this in the last episode with inner speech and mental imagery, but it goes further. Synesthesia is a real, well-documented neurological phenomenon where stimulation in one sense triggers an experience in a completely different sense. Some people with synesthesia see specific colors every time they hear a specific musical note. Some experience particular taste when they read certain words. some perceive numbers or days of the week as having fixed colors or spatial positions automatically without ever choosing to imagine it that way. That is not metaphorical for them. It is their literal, involuntary, perceptual experience every single time. And researchers have been able to confirm it is real and consistent using brain imaging and behavioral testing. Color blindness is another clear example. Someone with red green color blindness is not seeing a slightly duller version of red and green. Depending on the specific type, certain colors may appear nearly identical to them that look completely distinct to someone with standard color vision, because the cone cells in the retina that would normally distinguish those wavelengths are not functioning the way they do in most people. What both of these conditions prove, beyond any doubt, is that the relationship between a physical stimulus out in the world and the actual experience that stimulus produces inside someone's mind is not fixed and universal. It already varies measurably in ways we can document and study. The inverted spectrum thought experiment asks whether that variation might go even deeper than these documented cases, into territory we currently have no way to measure at all. I want to bring this back to threads that have run through this whole show, because I think this episode sits right at the center of nearly everything we have talked about. We have talked about the brain filtering reality, deleting and distorting and generalizing what actually reaches your conscious awareness. We have talked about how memory reconstructs itself every time you recall something, meaning even your past experiences are not fixed recordings, but living, shifting things. We just talked last episode about how dramatically different people's inner mental landscape can be, with some people narrating their lives in constant inner speech and others experiencing thought with no words at all. The hard problem of consciousness sits underneath every single one of those observations, because all of them assume there is an experience happening at all, a subject having the filtered reality, having the reconstructed memory, having the inner voice or the silence. The hard problem asks the question underneath that assumption. Why is there an experience here in the first place? Why does any of this physical activity in a brain produce a felt, subjective, first-person reality, rather than simply happening as pure mechanism with nobody inside to notice? This also connects directly to the near-death experience episode, where we asked whether consciousness is produced entirely by the brain or received by the brain, like a radio receiving a signal that exists independently on the radio itself. If consciousness is produced purely by physical brain activity, the hard problem suggests that explanation is still deeply incomplete, because physical activity alone has never been shown to logically require subjective experience to accompany it. If consciousness is instead something received, something more fundamental that the brain tunes into rather than generates from scratch, that would actually offer one possible way of addressing the hard problem, though it raises plenty of new mysteries on its own. I do not want this to feel like an abstract epidemic exercise with no connection to real life, because I do not think it is one. Think about what this means for how you relate to other people. Every single person you have ever loved, argued with, misunderstood, or felt completely understood by, you have never had access, direct access, to their inner experience. Not once. You have only had access to their behavior, their words, their expressions. And you have been inferring your whole life that there is a rich inner world behind all of that, similar in kind to your own. That interference is almost certainly correct. I'm not suggesting the people around you are philosophical zombies, but the fact that it has to be an inference at all that you cannot directly verify it, that you are taking it on faith built from a lifetime of pattern and behavior, says something important about the nature of connection between human beings. We are, every one of us, fundamentally private in a way that nothing else about reality is private. Your thoughts can be inferred from your behavior. Your felt experience cannot be directly observed by anyone, ever, including by the most advanced science we will probably ever develop. I think there is something that should make you both more humble and more compassionate once you really sit with that. Humble because you genuinely do not know exactly what the other person's inner world is like, no matter how close you are to them. And compassionate because everyone you meet is carrying around an entire private universe of experience that you will never fully access. And they are carrying the exact same mystery about you. I want to end that deep part of this episode with the question that I think this whole conversation is actually circling, even though it is rarely stated directly. If physical processes alone cannot, even in principle, explain why subjective experience exists, that raises a real question about what kind of universe we actually live in. Maybe consciousness really is just an unexplained byproduct of sufficiently complex physical systems. Something science will eventually crack, given enough time or better tools. That is a completely reasonable position held by serious scientists and philosophers. Or maybe consciousness is something more fundamental than that. Some philosophers and physicists have seriously proposed a view called panpsychism. The idea that some extremely basic form of experience might be a fundamental feature of reality itself, present in some minimal form event at a level of basic physical particles. With complex consciousness like ours emerging from highly organized combinations of the basic experimental property, rather than experience getting created from nothing once matter becomes sufficiently complicated. This is a genuine, actively debated position in academic philosophy of mind, not a fringe idea, though it remains controversial and far from settled. I'm not telling you which one of these is correct, because nobody currently knows. I'm telling you that the question itself, why does anything feel like anything at all, remains one of the most wide open mysteries in all of human inquiry, sitting right alongside questions about the origin of the universe and the nature of time itself. I want to know where you land on this one, genuinely. When you really sit with the question of whether your red is the same as everyone else's red, what does that bring up for you? Does it feel unsettling, fascinating, both at once? Have you ever had a moment with someone close to you where you realized their inner experience of something was completely different from what you assumed it was? Drop in the comments. I read every single one. That is episode 23, everybody. We went deep tonight, and I think it earned every minute of it. The question in this episode, or the questions in this episode, do not have answers yet, and maybe they never will. But I think sitting with a real, honest, unsolved mystery is worth more than most of the easy answers floating around out there. Follow the show on Spotify, Apple Podcast, iHeartRadio, or YouTube. And leave a rating if you can. Share this one with somebody who likes to think. New episodes tomorrow. Stay curious, take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you there.